Hello and welcome to this tutorial, which is going to be focusing on variable scope. So I did a video recently about variables and what they are. And in this tutorial, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how we might use variable scope in ways that will make it easier and better for our game coding. So in the previous tutorial, I looked at making a couple of different variables. I made one called duration where I stored the number 1000, and I created a variable called myWords which stored the actual characters for Andy's words, which was a type of variable called a string. So in this tutorial, we're going to be looking at why I used local there. So let's run this. Let's run just this so far. I'm going to press F5 and I'm going to open the console. And you can see that it's outputting 1000, which is what we said would happen when we've got a variable called duration and we're outputting 1000. Now, if I want to, what if I want to use my duration in an onTick method? So let's write out an onTick method here. So an onTick method is called every single time the game refreshes. And it's called from the server. You can do client onTick as well, which is called from your client. But at the moment, let's keep things all on the server. So in my onTick method, let's say I just want to output the duration every time the game updates. So I would do this, and then I would try running the game, and it's coming out as nil. And that is not ideal because I wanted my duration to be there, not nil. The reason it's nil is because I've used the local keyword here. So local means that this duration only exists between the function and the end. Actually, it's between where it's declared here and the end. So I can continue using duration down here. I could do another duration print statement for some reason. And I can keep using it in lots of different ways. I might, add one to duration. So duration plus 1. This is one way of adding a number or doing some arithmetic on a variable, by the way. So I can keep using duration within this function, but as soon as I leave this function or hit that end, that duration is completely wiped out. It's obliterated. It becomes nil. So when I try and use it in a different function, so this onTick chunk over here, duration no longer exists. For duration to exist, I need to set it up here. So I would need to do a new declaration of duration here. But that declaration there, because duration, this is now a new variable because I've created a new variable called this. It might be called the same thing, but because it exists in a different function, it's a new variable. So it will overwrite or it will ignore whatever was there before. And we can see this in action. So let's do, let's say duration is 1000, and let's take away delta time from duration. So if we wanted to, we would be trying to reduce the duration each tick. However, because we have to assign or create a new variable every frame, it means that the number never goes down. So how are we going to overcome this? We've got this local, there's got to be another way, right? We've got to be able to create a variable up here and then refer to it down here. Otherwise, what's the point in variables? Well, sometimes you can, local variables are really handy, and I'll go into the benefits of those in a minute. But in this situation, we're going to need to use what's called a class level variable, which is a variable that exists in the timer. So the timer is our class. It's kind of this area of our scripting in this file. And we want to store a variable that exists in the timer. So we can do that just by referring to it here. We can do self.duration equals 1000. So now let's get rid of that stuff because now we've got this instead. And this means that the variable duration has been given to the timer. The timer script itself now has a variable called duration. So rather than it just being a variable that exists from the moment it's declared until the next end statement, this now exists throughout wherever the timer is. As long as this has been run, which it is at the start, as long as this has been run, then the variable on the timer will exist. And we can see that. So let's have a look. if we output self.duration here in our onTick method, this is now referring to this. So whereas before it was nil when we output this, it's now 1000. So notice we didn't have to declare a new variable here. We can just refer to the self.duration, and that refers to that variable up there. So if we want to refer to a variable in a different function, we can use the self dot to give that variable to the class that we're in. So in this situation, timer, and then we can refer to it out throughout that class. Now there's one other way of managing our variable scope, and that's by putting a variable up here. So you can see this is the timer.properties section, and property is another term given to a variable, a class level variable. It's also sometimes called a field, and essentially rather than having self.duration, we could put up here name equals duration, and then give it the data type that we want. So we might want a number. And we put that between these squiggly brackets called parentheses. So now, rather than needing to set this up here, I could just give it a default number. And now I don't need to set it up there at all. In fact, I can now change this down here in the entity editor. There is one slight difference between self.duration and the new properties duration up here, and that is that we need to refer to the properties of the class now. So rather than just referring to the class which had a variable called duration attached to it, we now have duration as one of the properties of the class. So now we can do self.properties dot and then whatever we called it up here. So going back to our my words example, if I wanted to, I could create a variable up here called my words. Type would be a string. Remember, string of characters. And if we get rid of the default, you'll be able to see that my words has now appeared in our entity editor down here. And this can now be Andy's words. And I can output that here as well. Self.properties, and then using the name of the variable, which I gave it up here, my words, will now output that. So we're alternating between outputting 1000 and outputting Andy's words every time the game updates. So that's it, and that's some of the information about variable scope that you will really need to know in order to manage how your variables are being used. So why might we be using different variables at different sort of places? Well, it's a good idea to use the properties for things that you might want to change or tweak or set whilst you're in your game editor. Remember, you can access these in the entity editor while you're editing your game, so you don't have to go into the script and change some numbers and then go back to the game and do some tweaking here and then go back to the script. You can do it all in this view, that means, which is really, really handy. You could be moving around and you could say, oh, actually, I want this explosive device to have a duration of 500. The other thing is, or 50. The other thing is, if I duplicated this and moved it somewhere else, by having the properties accessible here, I can have different ones for different explosive devices. So maybe the duration of this timer is 200. So it's using the same code as this one, except it's got a slightly different duration. Whereas if I hard coded this in, so I said self.duration equals 200, that would then mean that every explosive device had to have the duration of 200. So that's the reason we would use the properties, is we want to be able to access them here, and we might want to have different ones for different entities, or different entities with that script attached. The reason we might use the self dot way of doing it is because if we do it this way, we're kind of hiding it from the accessible nature of this. So if we've got things that we don't want ourselves to accidentally tweak or change, or to try and avoid cluttering up this area too much with unnecessary variables that we want to just be behind the scenes, then that would be the reason we would use the class level variable without it being in the properties bag here. We could still put properties here if we wanted to in the init function. So and they won't appear here. So it's kind of personal preference with that. One of them is referring to the class, or one of them's referring to this properties bag. Sometimes it's a good idea to have everything in the properties function, field of the class, so that you don't accidentally get mixed up with lots of different places to have variables. So that might be a different option for you. So we can do self dot, we could do self dot properties dot. That would be the reason for that. And finally, why might we have local duration then? If we can hide things and avoid the clutter by doing it in different ways, then why would we use local? Well, the local term means that this variable is destroyed when it hits the next endpoint. And that's really handy too, because we don't want to accidentally have loads of memory being used up by our script with variables in them that we only use once, because we want to try and optimize this as much as possible so that Crayta can be making the most out of the memory that it's got. It wants to be able to run that game really fast, really smooth, and give the user a really great experience. And if we continue to clutter up all of the memory with variables that we don't need to be storing for long term, then we won't be able to give our users that really nice experience in the end. It also means that we don't accidentally, if I wanted to create a different duration over here, this would be the way to do this, rather than accidentally overwriting variables later on and stuff like that. So there's benefits to all of these different ways of using scope in our variables. There's reasons for doing it, and it's a good idea to think about what's the minimum amount of scope a variable, my variable needs. Does it have to be on the properties, or can it be a local variable? The smaller the scope that you give your variable, the better optimized your game will be, and ultimately the less cluttered your code will be, and the less sort of cluttered your entity editor will be. So there's some really good reasons to play around with variable scope and have a go. And don't forget, if you make a mistake, the compiler or the interpreter will tell you during gameplay in the console. It'll say, hey, I don't know what this variable means. So that's the worst that can happen, is it just tells you, I don't know what this variable is. And then you can go and investigate your variable scope in a little bit more detail. So hopefully that was useful. If you get stuck, don't forget we're on the Discord and we're willing to jump in and help you with your games. Let us know how you get on with the variable tutorial, and I look forward to seeing what you make with this stuff in Crayta.